If you were to narrow down one thing that was the final greatest evidence that was given to us that Jesus is the Son of God, what event do you think of? What is the ultimate event that finalized and concluded, yes, he definitely is the Son of God? Resurrection. After 3 days, he was raised from the tomb. If you got your Bible, turn to John chapter 2. If you're familiar with John, you think, why are we already talking about resurrection? John chapter 2. That's not till we get to John chapter 19 and 20. Because there's something that happens here in the text. And again, remember, John is trying to introduce Jesus and all of these thoughts about Jesus to this Greek world. And what John is going to do is, it is very similar. We talk on Sunday mornings about the book of Genesis and we're writing it to Eastern thinkers. John is the same. Well, that's still the Eastern culture. Now granted, it is 1,500 years after the book of Genesis was written, so a millennia and a half later, but they're still Eastern thinkers. And the way that they write, they still do a lot of the same things. And so much of what we see John do is paint these pictures almost in a way of saying, I want you to hunt for what do you think that's referring to? And he'll throw something in that, well, that shouldn't be there like that. And it would make an Eastern thinker dig around more and try to say, why would he say that here? That doesn't make sense. And there's one of those that comes up right at the very beginning of chapter 2. And we'll get into that here as we go on. But one thing that you learn when you're comparing biblical times with modern times is the differences in all the customs. And one of the big ones is marriage customs. There are a lot of things that are very similar that haven't changed much. There are some things that are a lot different. There's some things that they would have done in the first century that you girls, I don't think you would ever want to have been a part of your wedding celebration. So we have this story in John chapter 2, the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. We have a few of these accounts to give us a little bit of a picture of what these were like. We have Matthew 25, where it's the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, as they were also waiting for the bride and the bridegroom. But that again, it's all about a wedding feast. And so we get little hints of what things were like back then. So let's talk a little bit about these customs so that we can really kind of properly set the stage of this story that we read in John chapter 2. Because when we think of a wedding feast, we may have in our mind more of a Western culture wedding feast that we are used to. Well, that's not what they were dealing with. So it helps us to get a better idea of what's actually happening in this section if we know what was really happening in that culture. So in the first century, it all started with betrothal. Betrothal was a matter that was settled between the parents. And so parents would make a deal with each other, and they would betroth their son and their daughter to each other. And the son was almost always quite a bit older, and he had already usually had established himself in society, because a father who's wanting to betroth his daughter is usually only going to want to betroth her to a man who has already proven that he can take care of her. And so it wouldn't be uncommon for a man who was 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 to marry a young girl who was 15, 16, 20. 20 would have been pretty old for getting married back then. for a young lady. They were usually married at a very young age. In our culture, we would call her a young girl. But in that culture, as soon as she was of childbearing age, she was a woman who was of age to marry. And so the betrothal, it was a legal contract that would have been made between these two sets of parents. And when that betrothal was signed, their son and their daughter would have been considered at that moment husband and wife. Now, we haven't had a wedding, and we haven't had a wedding feast or anything, but in that culture, as soon as that betrothal was signed, then they were considered husband and wife. And so you even go to the story of Mary and Joseph, and they had not had a wedding, but they had been betrothed. And so Joseph's parents and Mary's parents had already gotten together and created the legal betrothal. There would have been the gifts given back and forth to each one to make all of it final. So you say there hasn't been a marriage yet. There hasn't been a wedding yet. But this would have been just as legally binding as if there had been a marriage and they had consummated that marriage. So there would be an agreement or agreed upon period of time, which then this wedding would be planned. And the wedding was extremely important to both sides of the family. This was a lot about status. It was a lot about honor. And so it was a very, very important event. So on the wedding day, here's what it kind of would have looked like. The bride, she would get together with all of her friends, and they would all get the bride ready. That sounds kind of familiar. We're kind of used to that. The groom, he would gather together all his buddies, and they would make a procession through town and go to the home of the bride, and they would collect her. They would bring her with them, and then they would bring her to the house where this wedding was going to be held. They did not do weddings in public buildings, public places back then. It would have been done in a home. It may have been one of the family's homes. It may have been a friend's home that was, if they maybe more wealthy, had a little more space. Sometimes it would have been held in the courtyard of the home. But during the ceremony, they would make their official vows to one another. And then immediately after, the wedding feast begins. The wedding feast was something that lasted for days. It may have been 2 or 3 days. Depending on the wealth of the family, it could have been 7 to 10 days. It was a major event. So the wedding feast, that first night, would last long into the night until they would send the bride and the groom into the house, into the bridal chamber, where they would spend their first night together. And everybody else would also spend the night there at the party. This was a party that was going to last for days. And so everybody stayed. And I mean, there's a lot of brides and grooms today that would go, I don't think so. Share our honeymoon with everybody? I don't think so. But that's what happened. And the Jewish custom then was for them to bring what was known as the betulim down out of the bridal chamber. The betulim, it was the sheet from their first marriage night. And what that did, they would actually hang it up in the courtyard. And it was so that everybody could see the evidence of the bride's virginity. How about that, ladies? That's something, I mean, it's a good ancient Jewish custom. We could arrange it. But this was an important thing to the families. This was about honor. It was an honor for the father of the bride to prove, I have protected my daughter. My daughter she's pure. And that was a big, big deal. And so, again, think about Joseph and Mary. So all of a sudden, they've been betrothed, but they haven't had the wedding feast yet. And then Mary is with child. And there's this discussion in the scriptures about Joseph. Should he send her away? But he doesn't. And the reason is because an angel has told him what's going on, and he has trusted that angel, and he takes Mary to be his wife anyway, most men, one you're betrothed to is pregnant. There's that break of trust and honor in the families, and what Joseph did was protected the honor of Mary, and he protected the honor of Mary's family, and even of his own family. And so there was a lot that was going on there. So they would display this sheet, and all of the women would start dancing and running around the yard, the courtyard, going, all kinds of noises that they'd be making, that they're celebrating the purity of this woman. And then the real party would get started. And it would go all that day and all that night and all the next day. And so doing the wedding feast properly and caring for all of your guests, that was a big deal for the family's honor. Now, every one of these wedding feasts had a man who was called a banquet master. We see here in chapter 2, look down to verse 8. It says, he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the head waiter. That there in the Greek is the word arklitriklinos. It's this literally is the idea of a banquet master. He's the guy in charge. So the family would have gone out and selected a friend or a family member, or maybe someone who was a professional banquet master who had a really good reputation for doing a good job. And it was his responsibility to make sure that nothing went wrong during this party. Got a quote that it's from an intertestamental book. So that's a book between the Old Testament and New Testament. It was written by a man named Jesus ben Sira. The book sometimes is called Ecclesiasticus, but sometimes it's called Sirach because of the guy who wrote it. He is talking about people in the community who have been appointed to be a banquet master at wedding feasts. This was a great honor to be asked to do this. This is what it says. If thou hast appointed banquet master, if thou hast been appointed banquet master, do not exalt thyself. Be to them as one of themselves. Supply their needs, and afterwards recline, that thou mayest rejoice on their account and receive consideration for politeness. And so, in other words, it's saying, you don't sit down and relax until you've made sure that everyone else has all of their needs taken care of. And if the wedding feast goes well, then the banquet master would be highly praised. He would be highly regarded. He would have been well respected in that community. If it didn't go well, then it was a huge insult. And it was an insult not only for him, but he just also insulted those families. Another quote, this is from Philo in a book that he wrote concerning this occupation of banquet master. It says, quote, "The services are rendered by freemen who perform their task as attendants with deliberate goodwill, anticipating eagerly and zealously the demands that may be made. It is not just any freemen who are appointed for these offices, but young members of the association chosen with care for their special merit. They give their services gladly and proudly. Now, the thing that's interesting about Philo is that he wrote this from Alexandria, Egypt, when he was living there, but he's writing at the exact same time that Jesus was alive. And so he's writing about the work of a banquet master in the same time as the culture of what we're reading in John chapter 2. So to fully understand what's going on in John 2, you have to understand that it was a very, very big deal for this guy who was in charge and for everything to go well. And it was an even bigger deal if it didn't go well. So I want to show you something else here. Look in your Bible in John chapter 1 and verse 19. Okay, John chapter 1 verse 19 says, "This is the testimony of John." And so that's where we started in chapter 1 of John beginning his testimony that the Apostle John is going to write about. So we can basically classify this and John's story of his gospel as day one. And you're going to see why that is. Because if you drop down in chapter 1 to verse 29, look at what it says. The next day. So this would be day 2. So verse 19 would have been the first day, day 1. Verse 29 is the next day. That would be day 2. Drop down and let's look at verse 35. Again, the next day. So that would be day 3 in this story that's being told. Look at verse 43. It says, the next day. So John's keeping a chronology of days as he's going through here of how things are happening. So that would be day 4. And so now logic tells us that if we continue to progress through the story, what should we see next? Day 5. But look what happens when we get to chapter 2 and verse 1. What's it say? On the 3rd day. Now some would say, okay, so he's just jumping back to day 3. But it doesn't seem like that's really what John's doing here. He says he doesn't do that. We talk about in Hebrew writing, what Moses does, they do that. They will write and then they'll back up and they'll write from another perspective and tell the same story. And they'll go a little bit further and then they'll back up and they'll tell from a different perspective the same story, and they just continue to do that. We don't see that in the New Testament. That's not how the Greeks wrote. And so this is one of those places for a first century Eastern thinker, they would be looking at this going, that's kind of weird. Why is John making a big deal out of day 3, the 3rd day here? And so if you remember back the introductory material when we first started looking at John, do you remember what Clement of Alexandria called John's gospel as compared to the other 3 gospels? Remember what we said? He referred to John's gospel as the spiritual gospel. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's obviously there's spiritual things about them. But the point that's being made is John is not just telling the facts. That's what Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Just the facts. John tells a story, but there's always a spiritual message attached to the story. And so we've talked a lot about this again in our Genesis class, but the same thing applies here. Were these people in John 1 and 2? We know that they are from that Eastern culture. And so as a spiritual gospel, John is going to use events and terminology to develop a spiritual message. We see it all through. We're going to see another one here in just a minute in John chapter 2. But we see it all through. You go to John chapter 4, and Jesus tells the woman, Well, whoever gives me this water, it's just living water. And what does she say? Well, how can you get water? You don't even have a pot to draw water with. Her mind is on the physical, the facts. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about something spiritual. You get to John chapter 6, and Jesus just fed the 5,000. And all these people are following Jesus around because what do they want more of? The bread. They want the physical. But that's not the reason why Jesus fed them that bread, was it? And we learn that because Jesus specifically then begins to talk about, I am the bread of life. He does this all through the gospel. And so there's the events that take place, and then there are the spiritual message behind what is actually going on here. And so the Gospel of John, it's been 60 years since the death of Jesus when John writes this gospel. And so 60 years after the death of Christ, what would you think that if a Christian is reading this and they read the words third day, what would they think of? Resurrection. And you might think, and this is something that even some of the material that I've been using from Brother Dan Owen, he even said this. He said, "You are free to think that I am out of my ever-loving mind." But after we go through a few more chapters in the gospel, I don't think that you will think that I'm as crazy as you thought I was back here in chapter 2. And he says there is, because as we walk through it, you see, initially you think, it's a stretch to say that that's referring to maybe the resurrection there, until you look at the whole context of what's happening in chapter 2. And you begin to see John is, again, writing to Greek and Roman readers. They don't know anything about Jesus. They don't know anything about his death and resurrection. But he's beginning to plant seeds already. Because so I started off with a question. If there's one event that is the evidence that Jesus is the Son of God, it's the resurrection. And so what we're seeing, it looks like, is that John is beginning to already plant seeds to start making them think about what is going to happen on the third day. And again, in the context, we're going to see more and more of him begin to build this point. So we don't have a whole lot more time, but let's look at the first few verses here in chapter 2. It says, on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Okay, so here's an interesting note. In Romans 3:23, when it says, all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that same phrase, fallen short, is the exact words that Mary uses here when she says ran out. The wine has run out. It's fallen short. They have messed up, is what she's saying. We don't know the connection. We don't know why Mary knows. And when we keep reading the story, it almost even seems like the guy who's in charge of this banquet doesn't even know yet. And so this is a problem. As we said, it's a big problem for the parents, but it's a major problem for the banquet master. And this is something that never should have happened. So Jesus' mother comes to him, it seems like privately, and informs Jesus of this embarrassing situation. All right, look at verse 4. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. Okay, my hour has not yet come. All right, look at these verses real quick. Flip over to chapter 7 and verse 30. What does Jesus talk about there? My hour has not yet come. He says it again there. Flip over to the next chapter, chapter 8 and verse 20. What does he say? My hour has not yet come. All right? And sometimes it's said a little bit differently, but you'll find the similar statements throughout the gospel all the way till we get to chapter 12. And we get to chapter 12, which is right before the final Passover meal, right before the last night, before Jesus is arrested and put on trial and crucified. So in chapter 12 and verse 23, look at what Jesus says there. It says, Jesus answers them saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Right? Drop down just a few verses. Look at verse 27. Now my soul has become troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Right? Look at chapter 13 and verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father. So what is the hour referring to? Resurrection. The hour is referring to when Jesus is going to leave this world and return to the Father. He is raised from the dead and he's going to ascend to be with the Father. Okay? But he didn't leave and go to the Father until what day? The third day. Right? Okay, so we're going to develop this further as we continue through chapter 2. But I just wanted to put it on your radar while we're here in chapter 2. And as we move on, even into chapter 3 and chapter 4, we're going to see a theme that is being built on. And for some reason, John starts this whole section out with day on the third day. And it wasn't the third day in the story. There's something not right about that. Why did he do that? And I think we're starting to get a little bit of a picture. John's planting seeds of an idea that's going to be the whole theme through the entire gospel. The whole point, I'm going to prove to you that Jesus is the Son of God, to people who've never heard of him before. And so we'll begin to see that continue to build as we go on. So we will pick up there next week.